So just a brief overview of the agenda. We'll start with a welcome from me. Then we'll have our guidelines presentation with a brief Q&A from Eva Colberg. Then we will go into breakout group discussions, and then we'll come back together around 12:55 for a wrap-up. Next slide, please. So I'm here representing the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Network, which is an organization that aims to reduce the compounding effects of invasive species and climate change through science synthesis, information sharing, and conducting priority research. RISC started in the Northeast and was born from the needs expressed by invasive species practitioners like you to better understand how climate change would impact their work. The first network meeting was held in 2016, and we've been growing steadily ever since. Next slide, please. So within our 4 mission areas, the network creates and is involved with a variety of products and events. These include science syntheses like our management challenges and research summaries, communicating practitioner needs like our surveys and workshops, building practitioner researcher communities through our annual symposium, webinars like this one, and our networking events, and conducting priority research like scientific papers and presentations. Next slide, please. So the Northeast RISC follows a translational science model, which aims to generate actionable ecological research while improving outcomes of invasive species management and policy decisions. We call this the Translational Invasion Ecology Model, or TIE. And in a nutshell, TIE translates science into practice and practice into science. TIE often requires some form of boundary spanning organization or a group whose mission includes connecting and coordinating research and management. And the Northeast RISC Management Network works to be such an organization to improve outcomes as well as shared benefits between researchers and managers. Next slide, please. The Northeast RISC resources and events are the product of a hard work of a large volunteer leadership team. And this group of about 20 people hold weekly working meetings to coordinate events, synthesize science, and conduct original research. But the Northeast RISC also includes a broader network of all of you of about over 750 people who engage through events like this, which makes Northeast RISC a useful resource for everyone. Next slide, please. So if you're interested, feel free to connect with us. You can visit us online at riscnetwork.org/northeast or join our listserv following the instructions on the screen, or you can email us at riskmanagement@gmail.com. And I'm excited to introduce Dr. Eva Colberg from Cornell University and the New York Invasive Species Research Institute, who will be telling us now more about her newly published work, Guidelines for Climate-Smart Invasive Species Management. Welcome, Eva.
Thank you so much, Matt, for the introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. I'm also just going to express a lot of gratitude to everyone who's been involved with this project, whether that's general feedback and insights or more specific comments and edits to the guidelines themselves. Thank you. I'm really excited to share with you all the results of this work. It's funded by the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. I'm a postdoc at Cornell, funded by NECASC. And as I go through the guidelines today, I'll give you some background and then give a little run through of the document itself. And then afterwards, we'll have some discussion to dive into not just what you're currently doing and how these guidelines might fit in with your current work, but how we can further facilitate the wider implementation of climate-smart invasive species management. So to define climate-smart invasive species management, we're saying it's any action that considers and aims to address the interactive effects of climate change and invasive species. And I'll note that that consideration part is pretty key because you might already be facing the effects of climate change and invasive species and reacting to that to the best of your ability. But having that explicit consideration and forward thinking about how these two different stressors can interact can ultimately help us consider how our management goals might change down the line and how those might be impacted in the future, and can help us develop overarching and long-term strategies to achieve our goals no matter what is thrown at us. Thinking about how climate change and invasive species interact, we know there are a couple big interactions that can impact management. So we know where invasive species occur and can have impacts is changing with climate change, as well as intercontinental scales of introduction, pathways of introduction. The timelines at which invasive species are active and reproducing, and therefore when management might be most appropriate, are also changing with climate change. And that can have further implications for the feasibility of treatment, as well as other aspects of climate change, like increasing temperatures, increasing CO2 levels, can also affect the efficacy of different treatment methods and invasive responses to them. We also know that in general, our native ecosystems and our targets for conservation and restoration might be increasingly vulnerable with these compounding effects of climate change and invasive species, which can ultimately change what our goals are and what we're working towards. And we know that in particular, the extreme climatic events and the increases in their frequency and intensity can have compounding effects with increasing where invasive species are being spread to, increasing their establishment success, and that can further feedback by affecting invasive species can potentially reduce our effect to withstand certain extreme events. So with all that in mind, in order to develop guidelines for climate smart invasive species management, that figure is coming from the first step, which is just a scientific literature review. We're working on sending that out for publication soon. But the science is only one part of it, and we also needed to know what managers are currently thinking about and facing on the ground, and where we're already being climate smart, as well as where we have room for improvement. And so to get managers' experiences and opinions on this, we're pulling from the RISCC 2023 survey that some of you might have even contributed to, as well as a series of research interviews I conducted with invasive species practitioners and decision makers in the Northeast. And these interviews are really to get more in-depth examples and stories about how folks are facing climate change and invasive species already, where they're being climate smart, where they're finding friction to that. All of that fed into developing drafts of these guidelines that were workshopped in person at the NY Invasive Species Expo last fall, and then a later draft was workshopped this spring via Zoom. And so the document that you've been sent links to in its current form is not a series of prescriptive recommendations, and it's not site-specific guidance. I want to acknowledge that those are definitely things that some of you have expressed a want for and a desire for, and those can be helpful in the future. But this is just our starting point. And so these guidelines are giving a broad view of the different stages of management at which we could incorporate climate change and invasive species. And so we're presenting a list of options to choose from that you as managers, as decision makers, as people who might implement these, can then further make decisions about what makes sense in your own context, given your own goals. Where might you be able to incorporate some of these, where might you need to tweak them? But ultimately, by putting them all together, that can help with this broad level thinking. That final point about highlighting areas in needed support, I also want to touch upon in a little more detail, because we know that there are a lot of barriers to being climate smart in your invasive species management, and there are a lot of barriers to being, in general, to doing any sort of invasive species management or climate adaptation separately. And so things like time, money, knowledge are, of course, all common barriers. Thinking about climate change and invasive species in particular, we can also have additional barriers to flexibility. And so a final section of these guidelines is outlining different ways in which we can address these barriers and which different entities can address those barriers. So policymakers, funders, research and boundary spanning organizations. We wanted to list out just some of the ways in which those can help support climate smart invasive species management. And so I'm going to give you a super brief overview of what some of these recommendations are. What I'll give you here is just, the broad condensed version. There are more details in the actual guideline document. So do make sure that you are referring to that if you want the full story. But we'll go through section by section. And I'll also tell you a little bit more about the reasoning and structure behind these guidelines as well. So just to start with, we do use IS and CC as abbreviations for invasive species and climate change. Don't be thrown off by that. We have a list of other acronyms at the second page as well, if you're ever confused by an acronym. And we have glossary of terms at the back if you're ever confused by a term. But just starting at that initial planning stage, thinking about what your mission, values, and goals are for your organization, realizing that not everyone is involved in this stage, but if you are, just thinking about incorporating invasive species and climate change into the language you use and into the broad goals you have can be a good starting point for allowing more climate smart invasive species management later on. But then you can start to get more specific. You can think about the potential impacts as shown in that figure and think about how that applies to your own systems, to your own management goals. You can think about more specifically certain tactics, things like early detection and rapid response, and how you can better incorporate climate change predictions into that invasive management technique approach. And then we also have a few recommendations that are less about climate change and invasive species specifically, and more generally about smart management strategies. And so we include things like this because they're important precursors to being able to be climate smart in your invasive species management. And especially if you're new to this field, or especially if you're dealing with maybe reluctant funders who might not see the whole picture, we wanted to make sure that we could still have some of these more basic, potentially more intuitive for some of you, recommendations still explicitly listed out because, again, they are still important building blocks. And so then thinking about other recommendations, we know that climate change and invasive species can impact your budgets. So thinking about where you're allocating funds might be changing. Knowing that in particular, climate change is affecting timelines of invasive species and therefore their management. And so that might affect your hiring timelines in particular, which might come into conflict with what you have available when you have, seasonal staff is most available when it's not the school year. Thinking about how we can bridge gaps between availability. And so we have more specifics in the guideline document itself for how to rethink those timelines. But then the last thing to touch upon in the budgeting section is just the fact that thinking about climate change in your invasive management work might further open new avenues of funding. And just thinking about the fact that if you're doing climate smart invasive species management, that is a form of climate adaptation. And you might be able to further collaborate with other climate adaptation projects as well as qualify for that sort of funding source. On a related note, scheduling and timelines in general, beyond just hiring timelines, are going to be affected by climate change's effects to invasive species, whether that's general shifts in when you have certain, available windows of opportunity, but also more erratic events and more erratic opportunities. And so just generally being prepared, we have more specific recommendations for how to be more flexible for those changes in your timelines. Also, particularly thinking about the extreme event aspect, knowing that that might not be an always all the time thing, but a more frequent likelihood can just increase the importance of having extreme event response plans that include invasive species management, making sure that that's part of your broad scheduling viewpoint. Thinking about more on-the-ground actions, we first started with preventative actions. And so if you read through the entire guideline document, you'll note that a lot of these recommendations here might be listed in later sections as well, multiple times. And that's also intentional in order to ensure that if you're focused on one or two of the broader categories, you're not missing any key suggestions. We're also using hyperlinks between redundant sections in order to just ensure that you can see all of the available suggestions. But in general, anything that's helping, again, prevent invasive species in general can also be helpful for thinking about preventing climate shifting invasive species. And so that's a lot of what this section covers. Thinking about treatment and control options, again, just knowing that major changes that climate change will have on your invasive management might be in the efficacy and feasibility realm. And so taking measures to be prepared for that. Monitoring and adaptive management are a huge part of being able to incorporate these changes and be aware of them and watch them as they're happening and be able to do something to track that. But again, that's an area where you might have, not enough know-how, not enough available staff. And so that could be an area where we might need to point more towards those areas of needed support. But then other aspects of treatment and control are also important to consider. How, what happens after that treatment and control? Are you doing anything afterwards? Are you doing follow-up plantings? that might not always be appropriate. So again, just being critical as you're evaluating these for your own contexts. Again, thinking about early detection and rapid response as potentially part of your treatment and control program, knowing that maybe that might reallocate some resources. And thinking about generally, are you disturbing the area as you're going out and doing certain treatments? Thinking back again, some of this might be very intuitive for you, might be general good best practices, but we want to make sure that we're including that as part of our overall guidelines so that we can ensure that we're not losing any necessary information. You'll also note that we have a section on complementary management. And so this might not be your traditional invasive species management, but this is something that can help support that. Like, for example, a lot of you have high herbivory pressure due to a lot of out of control deer populations. And so addressing that can also help your ecosystems potentially have a better ability to be resilient to climate change and invasive species. Other co-occurring stressors are given as examples in the guideline document. But we know that there are others out there, and you'll know what those might be best for your own sites. Also thinking about ways that we can generally boost native resilience beyond addressing those stressors. Often native planting can be a supplemental way to do that. And so generally thinking about other tactics for restoration can help, again, just generally enhance your ability to have whatever the ecosystem you want to have, whatever the community you want to have in light of these other stressors. And being more climate smart as you're choosing potential plants to be choosing managed relocation, maybe climate adaptive species. And I will point out that there's more work in this realm coming out of the Northeast RISC. Some of your co-hosts for today's event are part of that. So do stay tuned to the RISC if you want to know more about that. And then I won't go through all of our education and outreach suggestions, but I will just point out that in general, public outreach and education can help support climate smart invasive species management, as well as can generally help keep everyone who might be involved with invasive species management best informed. But we also include recommendations that are maybe less on the traditional education side and more on the self-education and outreach with potential collaborator side of things. So these are recommendations about collaborating with other managers, communicating with other managers, particularly ones that might be to the south of you, or just generally neighbors that, might be facing the first wave of a new spreading range. And so thinking about how you can also have these connections and communication pathways, as well as, again, there are areas for supporting organizations, boundary spanners like RISC, but also other organizations that can help facilitate this. And so with that in mind, those are our main sections of the guidelines. I won't go into all of the recommendations for supporting actions, but that is section 6, if that's relevant or interesting to you as well. And so I'm going to stop my speaking and open the floor up to questions. If we have any, you can raise your hand or write in the chat, whichever feels more comfortable for you. And if we don't have any questions too, we can move on into our discussion.
I have a question real quick. My air conditioner just turned on, which is perfect too. So let me move a little bit. So I'm part of a master's project team at the University of Michigan School for Environment Sustainability. And our team's working on a wetland project removing glossy buckthorn primarily, but there's plenty of other invasive species there. And we're really leaning toward, because our program it has a quick turnover rate. It's 2 years, and we're trying to figure out how to best do a strategic approach in longevity. So, like, how do we, after we've left our program, continue the work and not just let things grow back? We're focusing on non-herbicidal techniques, but I was wondering if there's anything that addresses that in the document in terms of, like, you talked about volunteer timelines and like coordinating best. So I wondered if any of the practitioners or you on here have suggestions for us.
Oh, that's a good question. And I think that's, maybe a gap that we still haven't covered in this document. I think in general, thinking about longevity of programs can be a big, determining factor of whether or not work actually continues to happen. And so maybe if we have anyone on the call with experience on that, I'd love to hear your opinion on that. I think that might be a way where maybe if you can find longer term collaborators that might be able to hold some of that space and keep that going as there's turnover in more seasonal stuff, and shorter term positions could help.
Yeah,
And generally documentation helps too.
Yeah, in part, we're looking at a site management plan for the property in particular. It's a university property, so that's one thing that we're thinking of, is having documentation that is prescriptive and that people, don't have to think about planning, they can just act on it.
Hey, Eva, we do something similar. We have written prescriptive plans that have like the next 5 years planned out, where there is like some adaptive language in there where people go back after the end of the treatment season and put in what they found and any suggestions on what might need to change for the following year. And it does help with informing next year's crop of seasonal workers to help with that. So it is helpful because we used to have the same issues.
Thanks
Thank
for
you,
sharing.
Matt.
Eva, it looks like we have some questions in the chat. So are there any recommendations about funding sources in your guidelines with low match requirements?
We don't go into that specific. I think that's an area where it could be interesting to collate more. But at the moment, that might also depend with what state you're working from, or if you're from Canada, it can be a different set as well.
Right. One other question that was in the chat is, do you consider the incorporation of other frameworks like resist, accept, direct in the guidelines? Because that seems like it would align very well with what you went through.
We don't explicitly go into resist, accept, direct. There have been other risk products that have discussed that. And we might reference one or two of those, but it is complementary for sure.
And then some people are wondering when a hard copy of these recommendations or final form will be available for practitioners.
Yes, hopefully within the next week. We're just waiting on a DOI from Cornell. And then that will be hosted on the RISC website. We'll have an announcement on there and we'll blast it to the listserv.
Great. Well, we have a couple more minutes. Does anyone have any other questions? Feel free to raise your hand on mute or type it in the chat. All right, we're going to get started on breakout rooms. See you all in a couple minutes. Have a good discussion.